Porn is training us to pursue poor intimacy. And even if you're not actively watching porn, some of the messages of pornography have been sprinkled throughout our culture, sprinkled throughout media and teaching, and there's a lot of myths that are being taught and perpetuated within the church. In The Great Sex Rescue, Shiela Gregoire says, quote, "Pornography is changing our world and the nature of our relationships. Instead of saying, 'I love you,' the message of porn is, 'I want to use you.'" And this is episode 5, where I'm looking at a number of the myths that are in this book, The Great Sex Rescue, which she's saying the church and popular teaching in the church is perpetuating myths that are preventing us from walking in sexual integrity and enjoying the intimacy in marriage that God has called us to. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see more in this series. Well, one of the things that she's pointing us to here in this chapter titled "Your Spouse is Not Your Methadone" is that we can't use our spouse to try to fulfill unhealthy needs, whether sexual or otherwise, that God has not intended. One of those things is that we're often communicating if a spouse struggles with pornography or sexual temptation, then the solution to that is for the other spouse to simply meet every sexual need that that spouse has. She says in a quote on page 103, quote, "The blame for men's porn use is laid at the women's feet." Now, if you don't want to see women blamed for men's porn use, hit the like button. It'll help this message to spread. It'll help this video to get to more people as well. So where do we see this? Where do we see this message being perpetuated in the church? Well, she gives the example of a Focus on the Family article titled "Sex is a Spiritual Need," which says, quote, "If you're married, your husband depends on you to be his partner in his battle against sexual temptation." Now, so far, so good. I think when one of our spouse struggles with something, let's say it was something different, overeating, alcohol, I don't know, the other spouse can be a help, can be an accountability partner. So far, we're starting out so good in this article. But then the article goes on to say, the author explains how sex is a man's main defense, abasing tremendous temptation. If he doesn't get enough, he will eventually succumb to porn, even though he doesn't want to, and even though he'd prefer to have sex with his wife. The underlying message here is this: men will sin if their wives don't meet their every sexual need. I want to say to that, no. Stop it. If you're thinking that, if you're believing that, if you're teaching that, if you're perpetuating, stop it. Now let's think of dozens of reasons why this is inaccurate, okay? What if one of you has to go on a business trip? What if your wife is pregnant? What if it's a high-risk pregnancy? What if she goes on bed rest when she's pregnant, right? What about right after birth and delivery? What about a period of sickness or another reason for separation? A really busy season? What about the monthly cycle? So you're telling me, in all of those, what we have communicated to women is that you must meet every sexual urge that your husband has. If not, he can't control himself and he's immediately going to run to porn, or perhaps even worse, have an affair. We have got to eliminate that type of teaching from everything we're teaching men and women about sex. Now, men, this is going to be a little controversial. I think what I'm going to say here may be a little bit spicy, so feel free to argue with me in the comments. But here's what I would say. If you can't make it through your wife's monthly cycle, 4 to 7 days, whatever that might be, without a sexual release, I believe it is an indication of a problem. Does that mean you'd be tempted, you'd have urges during that period? Yeah, you might, okay? And maybe depending on your age, that the amount of temptation that you're experiencing, the amount of testosterone in your body is going to be different. But if you can't make it through a few days without a sexual release, I think it is an indication that you are using your wife to fulfill something that she wasn't designed to fulfill. And that's why she's titled this chapter, "Your Spouse is Not Your Methadone." Now, if you disagree with me, argue with me in the comments. Tell me why I'm wrong. Because here's what pornography has trained us to do. If you've struggled with that, and if you followed this channel at all, I talk frequently about a 10-year period of addiction that I had to pornography. And one of the things that pornography addiction did in my life is that it trained me whenever I was having negative emotions, that I could satisfy that and feel better by quickly running to pornography. Pornography would meet the needs that I supposedly had, at least in the short term. And the challenge in marriage is not to substitute your spouse for all of those negative emotions meeting. My spouse cannot meet the emotions if I'm struggling or depressed. Now, she can be a help in that, absolutely, but she's not meant to fulfill what I was running to pornography to pursue. If you substitute your spouse like that, you're simply treating them as pornography. And which means rather than sex be an intimate, emotional, physical, spiritual connection with your wife, we are substituting sex to be a physical need and a physical release that we must have. And if we don't have it, we're going to run and sin and we're going to look at porn or do something like that. Now, I've been married long enough to know that sex in marriage is not always a 2-hour date followed by 2 hours by the fire, sipping wine, pouring out your heart, and then 45 minutes of physical intimacy where everybody is satisfied. I mean, we both have jobs. We've got 3 kids. We've got busy schedules. It's not always like that. But I know what it also can't be is just immediately one spouse gets an urge, goes and demands the other spouse meets that need. And if not, there's a threat that, well, then I'm going to run and sin. So the challenge here for both husbands and wives would be this: take ownership of your sins and temptations. Now, I believe and I try to communicate that as husbands and wives, or as even friends and peers, we can contribute to each other's sin. We can. We can also help each other not sin. There's another number of ways that we can do that. But we can never blame somebody else and say, I sinned because they did this. Now, that's how it started in the garden with Adam blaming God and Eve, and then Eve blaming the serpent. So blame is a part of the game. But take ownership for your situation. If you're struggling with sexual sin and sexual temptation, it is not your spouse's fault. If your spouse is struggling with that, it's not your fault. Let's see how we can partner with each other to love and serve, but not blame one another and demand that we meet unhealthy needs. All right, so let's revisit here and ask the question, is it okay to ask your partner for sex? Yes. Is it okay to ask your partner to help you clean? To sit down and have a conversation with you? Is it okay to ask them to partner with you and help you in a number of ways? Absolutely. But what's not okay is to say, hey, if you don't sit down and talk with me right now, I'm going to call a dating service and find somebody who will talk to me, right? We can't blame our spouse. We need to take ownership for our struggles and temptations. So what are a few takeaways from her chapter here, Your Spouse is Not Your Methadone? Well, one here I think is, don't get married believing that your spouse will fulfill some unhealthy physical or sexual desires that you have. Don't treat your spouse like a drug to cover any negative emotions that you have. They were not designed to fulfill that. Rather, we want to see a sexual intimacy as being mutual, loving, and serving of one another that leads to joy, and it's a tremendous blessing. Not something that you must have, or if not, you're going to run and sin. But what we can do is we can love and serve and sacrificially serve our spouses. Well, I think the Great Sex Rescue here is really pinpointing a lot of toxic messages that are within the church. I've got a few more videos coming out on this book and on this topic. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see those. And let me challenge you, if you found this video helpful, would you share it with one friend that you think could benefit from this message? Well, this is Jason for Soulfire, and I will catch you in the next one.